Welcome to the Boom Bap Kingdom.
We do have joining us. Our first guest is backstage and has arrived. He is a artist, a visual artist, a recording artist, a lyricist, a producer, and the creator of the Boom Bap Kingdom. Peace, brother. Thank you for joining us.
Peace. Today. Hey, peace, and thanks for inviting me.
And so, as a music producer, I guess I have to jump in and begin by asking, what was your journey into music production?
Okay, so that's really interesting. So back in like 81, wow. That's when I started really rhyming, like starting to go to, like I was like in the seventh grade, started hitting house parties, with the mic and started going in. There were a lot of dudes. You probably don't know, I'm from Amityville, Long Island originally. And we had a lot of guys, an influx of people moving into Long Island from the Bronx. So I had it was a real good situation for me to have a next door neighbor that had moved in from the Bronx, and their kids were a little older. They were like high school age, and I was like running around in the 5th, 6th grade. And those guys had the turntables, the mics, they were going in, they had a little crew. And they introduced me to the convention tapes, all the hip hop, et cetera, et cetera. They would hit me like, "Oh, shorty, here's the tapes." And, now I'm hearing Cold Crush and all these guys. And then I started buying records, Spoonie G, Fat Boys, et cetera, et cetera. And listen, I just got addicted to the culture. And once I started writing my own rhymes, at that point, I was like, oh, man, I need something to rhyme to. So that started the production journey. And so now we're talking like 83, 84. I bought the infamous Synsonic drums. So that was the first piece of gear I had, was the Synsonic drums. And it just morphed from there, Synsonic drums, turntables, other drum machines. But then there was a very pivotal moment for me. The Juice Crew started really popping. And if you listen to the Sonics, right, Run DMC, they were getting most of their production was coming from Davey DMX and Rick Rubin. And they had a very specific sonic. They were using the Lindrum, the Lin 9000, and then the typical, cut and scratch with the heavy guitar. And the sonic was pseudo street, but it wasn't really that break beat aesthetic that you would hear in the park, right? If a good DJ was cutting the break back and forth, you heard the breakbeat aesthetic. Run DMC was trying to mimic that, but they were not up on sampling at the time. So obviously, historically, the first guy to do that was Marley Marl. So when you hear, and Marley Marl discovered sampling upon an accident, it wasn't intentional. And once it occurred and he realized he could control that, he could take bits and chops off records, etc., make his own drum patterns. That was a game changer. So when you listen to the Juice Crew stuff, like for instance, just take the bridge and you hear those Impeach the President drum samples, et cetera, that horn, wham, 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 that Pete Rock is using right now with Common right there. So you see the cipher is coming back. And long story short, that sonic kind of changed my approach. And then the real pivotal change for me was when I heard Masters in the Game from the 45 King. That was the true pivotal change for me. And that was 1989. And so when I heard that, I said, oh, man, I have to figure out how this guy is making his beats. This guy, the 45 King, how is he doing that? And that really put me on the path. Eventually, I went to school for recording engineering and learned about MIDI and got exposed to different types of samplers. And the first sampler that I bought was the Ensoniq EPS. EPS, I had the EPS M. Then I bought a 16. I bought an EPS M, a Turbo, and then a 16 Plus. And that was cool, but I couldn't really get the drums doing what I wanted them to do. So eventually, I was able to get an MPC 60, and my original MPC 60 is still here. I'll try to get it in the shot. Here we are.
I see it. I see it.
From 1989. You know,
Wow. Wow.
I'm the original owner, and it still works flawlessly. You know,
Wow.
that was the journey. Long story, but those little pivotal events, hearing the sonics change, the tones change. And then what really took it, I think, to another level is like 1992, when guys like the next generation, your large professors, your Pete Rocks, your premieres, those guys were, I would say, the generation after your Marley Marls. Marley Marl would have been after your Davy DMXs and your Orange Crush and your Rick Rubins. You know what I mean? So you see the layers, and as the layers progress, the sonics changed. And at that point, it was on from there.
Now, you mentioned Rick Rubin, you mentioned Davy DMX, you also mentioned Large Professor and Pete Rock.
Yes, sir.
And I feel like there are some names of producers. You also mentioned 45 King. I feel like there are some producers, when we talk about production, that don't get mentioned. High on that list for me is the Bomb Squad. People talk about favorite producers. And then
1988. Yeah.
Sure. And I think the conversation about producers in rap is incomplete if you don't mention Prince Paul, which most people don't mention.
Okay, so that's a loaded question because I know these guys personally, right? I grew up with De La, grew up with Prince Paul, Don Newkirk, rest in power. And in all honesty, I'll give an honest opinion about that. From a DJ, so let's keep in mind, Prince Paul started out as a DJ in Stetsasonic, and and in those days, Daddy-O and Delight were doing the production for Stetsasonic. They really weren't letting Paul do anything on those Stet albums. He was pretty much relegated to DJ tasks. But when he had the idea for De La, he put Mace, Paz, and Dave together and had this concept idea, which when you really kind of look at it was a play off of the Jungle Brothers. Now, in terms of production, obviously they were going for something different, right? Not just with the sonics, but with the physical appearance. And I think that they hit that on the mark. But I think the problem for De La and Prince Paul was they had opportunity that they didn't take as serious as the competition. So when you look at an Eric Sermon, right, EPMD, Brentwood, Long Island, we're only a couple of towns away. And these guys were in the lab. They were heavily influenced by rock, heavily inspired by God, but then they were able to find themselves on that second, third album. They found their sound, and they took their opportunity serious. They started putting people on, Redman, Keith Murray, K Solo, et cetera, et cetera. De La was more, I think, with Prince Paul in particular, they were more of a parody. And it was more of, in that first album, kind of making fun of what the norm was in those days. Guys running around with fat gold chains, BVDs, Gazelles, this, that, and the third. And I understood that concept, right? And I believe that Paul's production lent itself very well to that concept. So, you got to give him his props. He's the inventor of the hip hop skit. You got to give him his props. The way the album flowed, arrangement, it was otherworldly. When you look at 3 Feet High and Rising, it was one of those dichotomy type shifts where everyone is doing this, and now we're going to do this. And I think that what he brought to the game was incredible. It was fantastic. No one was doing it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And so I mentioned Bomb Squad as well as Prince Paul, because not only because they're from Long Island, but when they came out originally, they changed the way rap music was produced. So there was
absolutely.
There was a bomb, like there was pre-Bomb Squad and there was post-Bomb Squad. There was pre-Prince Paul and there was post-Prince Paul. And I don't think there's any other producers in rap that you could say changed the sound of the music the way they did. You agree with that?
Yeah, I do. Like, if you look at Bomb Squad, you can see how Dungeon Family, coming out of Atlanta, was heavily influenced by Bomb Squad. You could see how early Dr. Dre, NWA, heavily influenced by the Bomb Squad. It is, in my opinion, it's actually safe to say that NWA was Los Angeles's version of Public Enemy. You could put that out there. And definitely sonically, when you listen to the first album and portions of the second NWA album, you can hear the tremendous Bomb Squad influence. Hence, Ice Cube going to New York, linking up with Chuck to do his first solo album, because the sonic aesthetic was so familiar, so similar, that actually made a lot of sense. So I will say, yes, Bomb Squad definitely was a game changer. Low key, there was a kid coming out of Freeport, Gary G. Wiz, who was actually also making a lot of those beats and not getting his credit. He later ended up suing Keith Shockley to get some of the credit that he felt he deserved. So there's a little bit of backstory, behind Bomb Squad and those guys, and where exactly all that production was coming from. But in general terms, yes, those guys were incredible. No one was doing what they were doing at the time. And Prince Paul, yeah, he's a legend. And I think with Prince Paul, what gets interesting in the world of production is when Pete Rock stepped in. And that's when you get a real change where the producer becomes the focal point. Because before then, no one cared about the beats. Let's keep it real. It was, if you were reading the source and they gave a review, they never talked about who the producer was. And then post Pete Rock, you get produced by. That's when it started to matter. It started to matter because Pete Rock is, not only was he with CL Smooth making hit records, but when other artists began to hire him and he was making hit singles for all these guys, I think that created the business lane in production. He was running around getting like 10 grand a beat in those days, plus his publishing. And he was smart. He would get on the track and he would do a hook. So now he's going to get writers publishing, plus he gets his production credit and that publishing. Yeah, Pete knew what he was doing, yo. He switched it up,
Yeah, most definitely. Now, you mentioned NWA. You made a good point.
Yes, sir.
The production was very influenced by Bomb Squad. So that was Dr. Dre.
Yes, sir.
The content in terms of lyrics, MC Ren said in an interview recently that they were inspired in terms of content a lot by BDP. So the lyricists in the group were inspired by BDP, and the production was inspired by the Bomb Squad.
Now, would that lyricism was that BDP first album? I would imagine they're talking the first album.
Oh yeah, first BDP album was 1987.
Yeah,
and this was the first time we heard any glorification of intergroup violence on record among Black people. And this is also the first time we get guns on the album cover. Now listen.
Heavy.
Yeah. listen to NWA first album, and they talking that street talk, being very influenced by BDP, and they're holding guns on the album cover. So, I feel like a lot of what we're seeing in rap now, the downturn, it began with BDP Criminal Minded, and I'm going to do a show on that one day. A lot of people push back against that, but I have receipts.
I agree with you. I agree. I believe BDP and Cool G Rap. In my opinion, Cool G Rap is the original hip hop East Coast gangster. I think Cool G Rap was like one of the guys that really was inspiring a lot of the heavy gun talk. And I think he took it, his lyrics were so visual that Cool G Rap was able to take that gun talk and that gangster talk to another level. Hence, Cool G Rap going to LA to do a solo album back in the days. Because low key, you bring up an excellent point. Because when you look at hip hop culture, what we see through, and people can say whatever they want about the group and the individuals. However, Zulu Nation was very pivotal in stopping violence, bringing crews together and allowing them to have a safe place to express themselves through the music, art, dance, et cetera, hence the 5 elements, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at early 70s New York and you understand the gang violence, and then understand that New York hip hop was responsible for ending gang violence, it's very ironic how it circled back. And now in the Bronx, you got these kids running around, Crips, Bloods, blah, 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 where in the Bronx, where the culture started, we got rid of that in order to move the hip hop culture forward. So it's very ironic how that cipher came full circle. And it makes, there is no guess that LA was heavily influenced by New York. The whole world was in those days.
Absolutely. So I would like to talk about the Boom Bap Kingdom on YouTube.
Sure.
How would you explain that? What can you tell us about that?
Well, what I wanted to do is, especially as a older artist, just being an older MC and putting out records and stuff, it's not necessarily appreciated as much. Now I think there's a shift, and personally, I always knew there would be a good shift. I think if you're nice, you should just put your stuff out. RZA told me that once. He said, yo, if you got dope stuff, just put it out. Don't sit on it. And that really stuck with me, because I was in a Gravedigger recording session with those cats, and I, me and Poetic was super close. You remember this? And RZA was like, yo, they had played some of my stuff and was like, yo, you should put this out, bro, blah, 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 blah. Don't sit on dope stuff. And I was like, oh, that's kind of ill. And with that being said, I started playing with the concept of, hey, I love the boom bap aesthetic, that era in time. And I didn't want that sonic to fade into oblivion. So I decided I would start a YouTube channel and show my production process. Every producer has a slightly different process. I get that. But I wanted to keep the boom bap sonics and aesthetic alive and well, and show and prove that it's still viable. So that was really the idea. And then the other side of that coin was I wanted to archive myself in my element, doing something that makes me happy, that when I move on to the essence, my seeds can jump on YouTube and say, hey, look at my pops. He was doing this thing, 100 years ago. Just preserve my own history. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's yeah.
I get it. You mentioned poetic.
Yes, sir.
You actually had opportunity to do some production for Poetic after he transitioned. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, that, and this is a funny thing. So, after he transitioned, his wisdom reached out, and she told me that he had a lot of acapellas that he had recorded. So he was at that point, his health had came to a point where I don't think he could really get in the studio the way he wanted to. He had a lab at his sister's crib in the basement. That's where he was at the time. And then I think I don't know, I think they relocated to Jersey, him and the wife or something like that. Long story short, he passed on. A couple of years later, she did reach out and said she had a bunch of ADATs on him with acapellas. And wow, we're talking like 14 years ago. She reached out, and I told her, hey, we can make copies of those ADATs if, she said that. And the ironic thing was he told her to find me, and she was able to locate me. He said, hey, this is the only dude that I would trust to do this. Find him and get in the lab with these acapellas. And low key, he actually had his own label. It was Plasma, was the name of that record company. But he also had some kind of business arrangement with Jay Prince out there in Texas. And they were going to get this album out. But the wife never really, she was too scared to send the DATs out to be copied. She didn't want them to get damaged. And I understood that because at the time, DAT technology had fell out of favor. People were already recording straight to hard drive. They're burning CDs and such. Nobody was really using DATs at that point. And you had to find special companies that could make copies if you didn't have your own lab where you could just fly it in to your door and export the WAV files. So I found a place for her, but she just didn't trust that they would preserve those tapes and not damage the originals. So that's where that happened. Ironically, on one of my Boom Bap Kingdom episodes, I did an episode with the SP404 Mark II. When I made that beat, it reminded me of God. So I ripped freestyle from him and arranged some vocals, turned it into a hook, with a 16, put it out. And his daughter reached out to me. She's a huge artist in Germany, actually. So his daughter speaks fluent German, and she lives out in Europe, and she's doing her thing. The sonics, totally different, kind of sounds like what the kids are doing today. But yeah, his seed reached out, and that was cool.
Wow. And now you also, just to exemplify your production skills, one episode of the Boom Bap Kingdom, you actually took some acapella from Dave, from De La Soul, and did something.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
What happened there?
Well, I did a couple, right? So I did one for Biz when I heard it. Because look, bro, we're Strong Island soldiers, bro. You know what I mean? I still, in my heart of hearts, I still believe that Long Island doesn't get the props it deserves when you look at the grand scheme of things, even though LI produced legends. Everybody still wants to talk about Queens, Brooklyn, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, when our legends move on to the Essence, I want to honor them. And I usually do that by making a song, you know, with some of my favorite lyrics from them. I'll cook up a new beat from scratch. And it's almost like being in a recording session with that person. That's kind of how I approach it, you know. So I'll pick the bars, make the beat from scratch, and then, you know, put it all together. And that one that I made for Dave, that was that one meant a lot to me because you know, we Dave and I had a love-hate relationship, but that he was my dude, you know. I always respected them cats.
Put Boom Bap Kingdom in the chat. So I'm sending people, go to the Boom Bap Kingdom, and also go to the website too and get some of that merch. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, you repping. I appreciate that, God.